The pervasive hum of the Galactic Peacekeeping Fleet citadel was a constant, low thrum against Cadet Zola Maeve's boots. It was a sound that underscored the polished gleam of multispectral alien alloys and the sterile chill in the circulated air. For most, it was background noise. For Zola, it was a subtle vibration, a constant reminder of the unseen, intricate machinery that held the Confederation together. She walked with a quiet purpose, her human form slight amidst the towering Kr'Varnians and the undulating Galax, her uniform crisp, concealing an internal intensity that belied her unassuming facade. Today, the hum felt less a lullaby of order and more a frantic, dissonant chord. The galaxy was on the precipice. A cosmic anomaly, a tear in spacetime near the crucial trade lanes of the Corvus Alpha sector, was threatening to unravel a delicate, centuries-old alliance between the belligerent Kr'Varnians, the mercantile Galax, and the fiercely territorial Tikal. Diplomacy had stalled. Military posturing had only escalated tensions. The fleet's traditionalists were out of options. Zola entered the briefing room, a grand, circular chamber dominated by a hollow display at its center. The air, usually scentless, carried the distinct, metallic tang of Kr'Varnian anxiety and the subtle, cloying pheromones of Galaxian distress. Commander Vorlag, a mountain of Kr'Varnian muscle with scales like burnished obsidian, stood at the head of the table, his posture radiating rigid authority. His compound eyes swept over the assembled officers, pausing briefly on Zola, a flicker of unreadable dismissal, perhaps, or annoyance before moving on. Ensign Cathar, a Catharan with glistening, segmented antennae that twitched nervously, sat to Vorlag's right, his logical mind already burdened by the impending collapse. The anomaly grows, Vorlag's voice boomed, translated into a dozen languages simultaneously. The Corvus Alpha passage is nearly impassable. Our last diplomatic overture was met with a declaration of intent to withdraw from the alliance by the Tikal. Delegate Xylos remains inflexible. He gestured, and the hollow display shimmered, showing the cosmic disturbance expanding like an angry bruise, accompanied by flashing red alerts denoting increased energy fluctuations and broken communication lines. Zola cleared her throat, her voice calm and clear, a stark contrast to Vorlag's rumble. Commander, if I may, my analysis of the delegates' psychometric data indicates that the Tikal's intransigence, particularly Delegate Xylos's, stems from a profound, species-wide trauma. Their historical record of the Great Blight suggests a deep-seated fear of environmental disruption and isolation. She paused, allowing the data to populate the holographic display, showing complex algorithms predicting emotional responses. My proposal is to address this underlying emotional trauma, rather than continuing with traditional displays of force. Vorlag's crimson eyes narrowed, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Cadet Maeve, he interrupted, his tone laced with thinly veiled contempt, we are not hosting a communal therapy session. This is the Galactic Peacekeeping Fleet, not a creche for feelings. He thumped a massive fist on the table, the metallic clang echoing. Your human-centric empathy is a primitive concept. Our protocols demand a show of strength, a demonstration of resolve. We will deploy the interdiction fleet. That is a language all species understand. A ripple of low frequency chittering from the Galaxian delegate and a series of sharp, mechanical clicks from a Xylaran officer underscored Vorlag's dismissal. They clearly found Zola's soft science laughable, an embarrassing human quirk. Cathar's antennae drooped slightly, a visible sign of discomfort. He had reviewed Zola's preliminary data and recognized the startling, if unconventional, insights. Yet, even his logical mind struggled to reconcile her methods with fleet tradition. Zola felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but it was quickly subsumed by a cold, unwavering determination. They underestimated humanity. They underestimated her. This crisis, she realized, was her crucible. The following days spiraled into a controlled chaos within the Citadel's central command. The bustling operations center, usually a symphony of controlled efficiency, became a cacophony of panic-translated shouts and the frantic flashing of tactical displays. Holographic projections of the Anomaly pulsed angry reds and oranges, accompanied by dire predictions of ecological collapse in the Corvus Alpha systems and, more critically, the total fracturing of the Alliance. Reports flooded in increased energy fluctuations, diplomatic communications breaking down entirely, minor skirmishes flaring at the disputed borders. Commander Vorlag, usually a paragon of stoic resolve, was visibly frayed. His metallic scales seemed duller, his movements sharper, more agitated. He barked orders into the comlink, his voice strained, dispatching cruisers, activating defense grids, initiating peace talks that dissolved before they began. Each traditional military maneuver, each diplomatic posturing, proved utterly ineffective. The delegates were dug in, their fear and paranoia feeding their intransigence. Vorlag's face, usually impassive, showed a rare, dawning despair that cracked his rigid facade. From the periphery, Zola Maeve observed. Her position as a junior cadet meant she was relegated to data analysis, sorting through the deluge of failed reports. Yet her gaze rarely left the faces of the officers, particularly Vorlag's. Her earlier analysis had been chillingly accurate. Brute force and threats of reprisal were only exacerbating the underlying anxieties. The cosmic anomaly was a catalyst, not the root cause. She saw the futility in Vorlag's actions, a confirmation that her soft science was the only viable path forward. Ensign Cathar, seated at a console near Zola, nervously sifted through his own streams of tactical data. His antennae twitched almost uncontrollably as he correlated the escalating failures with Zola's earlier, dismissed predictions. He shot a glance at her, a silent admission of her foresight, his logical mind grudgingly accepting that something fundamental was being missed. Zola offered a small, knowing nod, her resolve hardening with each failed attempt by the traditionalists. The crisis deepened, and so did her conviction. A few days later, Zola decided it was time for her first subtle touch. She found Alar, a junior aide to the mercantile Galaxian delegate, in one of the Citadel's bustling public cafeterias. The space hummed with conversational chatter and a dizzying array of alien scents, sweet, acrid, metallic, but Zola's focus was singular. Alar was a slender, multi-limbed creature, its iridescent skin currently showing a dull gray flush, indicating profound stress within Galaxian physiology. Zola had already compiled a detailed psychometric profile of the aide. Noting Alar's intense personal ambition and deep-seated anxiety about its species' reputation for indecision in crises, Zola approached Alar's table, balancing a nutrient paste tube in one hand, and accidentally stumbled, jostling the aide's elaborate meal of bioluminescent algae. "Oh, my apologies, Alar," Zola exclaimed, her voice pitched with genuine concern, though her internal monologue remained clinically detached. "My spatial awareness must be compromised by the constant stress of the anomaly." Alar recoiled, its multiple eyes darting around in alarm, its gray flush deepening. No harm done, Cadet Maeve," it stammered, frantically dabbing at the spilled algae with a sonic napkin. "Though I confess, the diplomatic stalemate is taxing. Delegate Eskrill's reputation, and indeed our species' standing as swift negotiators, is suffering." Zola nodded sympathetically, her eyes catching the almost imperceptible tremor in Alar's lower limbs. "Indeed, it's a terrible burden, particularly for those who bear the weight of their delegates' decisions. I've been reviewing the recent diplomatic logs, and it seems Delegate Xylos of the TCAL has been particularly unresponsive to any attempts at conciliation, despite the growing danger to his people's ancestral territories. Perhaps a fresh perspective on the imminent threat to those territories might shift his focus." She paused, letting the implication hang, observing the subtle tightening of Alar's ocular muscles. Or perhaps a subtle reframing of the anomaly's threat, emphasizing the potential for long-term ecological damage rather than immediate tactical losses. "The TCAL are deeply rooted in their environment, yes." Alar's antennae twitched, its multifaceted mind visibly processing Zola's carefully chosen words. The stress lines around its eyes lessened, replaced by a flicker of intelligent calculation. "Ecological damage? Yes, the delegate has always been profoundly concerned with the long-term impact on the ancestral forests. I had not considered presenting it that way." "My thanks, Cadet. Your human insights are surprisingly nuanced." Alar offered a shallow, formal bow, then quickly excused itself, clearly eager to act on Zola's veiled advice. From a nearby alcove, Ensign Cathar observed the entire exchange, his segmented antennae flat against his skull. He approached Zola as Alar hurried away, a mix of fascination and palpable unease on his face. "Cadet Maeve," he began, his voice a low, precise murmur. "That was an exquisite application of influence. You identified Alar's specific anxiety regarding Galaxian diplomatic reputation and its personal ambition, then offered a solution that shifted its immediate goal toward yours. subtly altering the trajectory of the Galaxian delegates' next interaction, all without a direct command or even overt request. Zola met his gaze, a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. It's not about giving orders, Ensign. It's about understanding the internal mechanisms that drive behavior. Alar desired to impress its delegate and uphold its species' image. I merely provided a pathway that allowed it to do both, while subtly nudging the Tikal delegate where Vorlag's brute force could not. Cathar shuddered, a barely perceptible ripple through his form. It is unnerving to dissect a consciousness so thoroughly, to manipulate without their knowledge. My species' ethical framework places a high value on autonomy and direct communication. What you did, Cadet, borders on violation. That night, within the cramped, functional privacy of Zola's quarters, Cathar confronted her directly. The air purifier hummed softly, a stark contrast to the cacophony of the Citadel, lending an intimate hush to the conversation. Cathar's antennae twitched, a telltale sign of his internal discomfort. Cadet Maeve, he began, his logical voice strained, I am compelled to speak to you about the methods you employed with Aid Alar. My species' ethical subroutines register a profound disquiet. It was manipulation, a violation of the individual's free will, regardless of the outcome. Zola sat on her bunk, her posture relaxed, but her eyes held an unyielding intensity. She understood Cathar's reservations. They mirrored the ingrained galactic prejudice against humanity's primitive emotionality. Ensign, she responded, her voice calm and measured, let us define manipulation. My field, interspecies psychological dynamics, seeks to understand how consciousnesses process information, form beliefs, and make decisions. Malicious empathy, as you might call it, isn't about inflicting harm. It's about strategically leveraging existing emotional vulnerabilities, existing traumas, existing ambitions to achieve a necessary outcome. It's the difference between breaking a limb and nudging a joint that is already dislocated back into place. She leaned forward, her gaze piercing. Consider the alternative. Commander Vorlag's methods, the show of force, the threats, the rigid protocols, have brought us to the brink of galactic war. Millions, if not billions, of sentient lives are at stake. Is it more ethical to allow an alliance to collapse due to unaddressed trauma, leading to widespread conflict and death, or to strategically reroute the psychological pathways of a single delegate to avert that catastrophe? Cathar's optical sensors widened, processing her words with meticulous care. The utilitarian argument is compelling, Cadet, but the cost to the individual delegate Xylos, for instance, to exploit his species' trauma, as your earlier data suggested, is a terrifying prospect. Terror, Zola acknowledged, her voice almost a whisper, is a powerful motivator. But consider, the Tikal's trauma, the Great Blight, already exists. It dictates their behavior. It is a wound that shapes their decisions. I am not creating new pain. I am identifying existing pain and, yes, leveraging it to force a reevaluation of priorities that serves the greater good. It is efficient. It is surgical. It is, I believe, the only pathway to preventing what Vorlag's methods cannot. Cathar remained silent for a long moment, his antennae twitching, his logical processors wrestling with the ethical paradox. He saw the cold brilliance in her reasoning, the chilling efficacy of her approach. It was a power unlike anything his species, or indeed the galaxy, had ever considered as a legitimate tool of diplomacy. I am disturbed, he finally admitted, his voice barely audible. Profoundly so, but I cannot deny the logical and strategic brilliance, Cadet. If the alliance falls, it will be catastrophic. My ethical programming compels me to mitigate that risk, even if the methods leave me deeply unsettled. He looked at her, his eyes unblinking. I will assist you, Cadet, but know this, I will also be observing. A moral watchdog, if you will, to ensure that the greater good does not become merely a justification for unchecked power. Zola allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Fair enough, Ensign. A watchdog is precisely what humanity needs in this galaxy, and perhaps what I need. She knew she had gained a crucial, if morally conflicted, ally. The next phase of Zola's strategy began in the stark, silent expanse of her simulation chamber. Holographic projections shimmered around them, streams of data flowing like intricate rivers of light. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the projectors. Zola stood at the center, a digital map of the Tikal homeworld, Katerha, unfurling beneath her feet, ancient forest structures reaching into a purple sky. Delegate Xylos is the linchpin, Zola stated, her voice devoid of emotion. His rigidity is not merely cultural, but a direct manifestation of his species' most profound trauma. The Great Blight? She gestured, and the holographic forest warped, showing desiccated trees, a desolate landscape. Then ancient Tikal figures huddled in fear. Approximately 500 cycles ago, a cosmic plague, the Great Blight, swept through Katerha, nearly annihilating the Tikal. They survived only by retreating into subterranean root cities, enduring generations of darkness and resource scarcity. Cathar watched, his internal processors whirring, the horror mounting in his logical mind. A collective psychological scar, he murmured. Precisely, Zola confirmed. This event instilled a species-wide, genetically ingrained fear of environmental disruption and any perceived loss of their ancestral lands, no matter how small. Xylos's stoicism, his unwavering stance on territorial integrity in the Corvus Alpha sector, is not merely pride. It is a primal fear response, amplified by a collective memory of near extinction. His people believe that any compromise, any perceived weakness, will lead to another blight. Their honor is tied to their survival, and their survival is tied to the absolute sanctity of their land. She then projected complex psychometric overlays onto Xylos's holographic representation. My plan is to gently but systematically re-trigger aspects of this trauma, not to destroy, but to force a reevaluation of priorities within Xylos's deep psyche. Cathar flinched. Re-trigger. Cadet, you mean to induce a psychic breakdown? To force a being to relive their species' most horrific moments? His voice was thin, horrified. Zola's gaze was cold, unyielding. I will not inflict pain he does not already carry. I will amplify the existing anxiety, the latent despair that already governs his every decision. He fears losing his people's territories to the Anomaly. I will merely make that fear more immediate, more visceral than his fear of compromise. I will show him, through subtle but potent psychological cues, that his current rigidity is leading his people back to a state of desolation, not away from it. The goal is to make capitulation the lesser of two evils, the only path to genuine survival. She activated a simulation, and the chamber filled with faint, synthesized whispers, sounds reminiscent of dying foliage, and subtle visual distortions that mimic the onset of the blight. Cathar stumbled back, clutching his head, his ethical programming screaming in protest. The realism was terrifying. The target is his profound sense of responsibility, Zola continued, oblivious to Cathar's distress. His burden as the protector of his people. I will leverage the symbolic imagery of desolation, of the Tikal being uprooted and cast adrift. The deep-seated, culturally ingrained trauma of the Tikal species is precisely what makes them so unyielding, and also, paradoxically, their ultimate vulnerability. He will be made to choose between an imagined dignity and the very real survival of his species. It will be an Armageddon of the mind. Cathar stood trembling, moral revulsion warring with intellectual awe. The plan was chillingly precise, utterly devastating. He felt a deep fear, not just for Xylos, but for the future of diplomacy, for the very concept of galactic peace when such a weapon existed. Zola looked at him, her face impassive. Are you ready, Ensign, for what we must do? The air in Commander Vorlag's private office was thick with a tension that felt more substantial than the pressure in the anomaly zone itself. It was a Spartan, imposing room, dominated by a large viewport that displayed a panoramic view of distant, indifferent stars, mocking the desperate struggle unfolding within the citadel. Vorlag stood before the viewport, his massive form rigid, his scales reflecting the cold starlight. Cathar stood a few paces behind Zola, his antennae pressed close to his skull, his features grim. Zola, however, radiated calm. She laid out her full psychological strategy to Vorlag with dispassionate precision, her voice a stark contrast to the thrumming anxiety in the room. She detailed the specific triggers, the planned sequence of environmental cues, the carefully crafted linguistic patterns designed to bypass Xylos's conscious defenses and speak directly to his species' most profound, buried trauma. Commander, she concluded, her voice unwavering, there are no traditional alternatives left. Your fleet maneuvers have failed. Your diplomatic overtures have been rejected. The alliance is ours from catastrophic collapse. Delegate Xylos will not yield to force. He will only yield to the overwhelming imperative of his species' survival, reframed through his own traumatic lens. Vorlag slowly turned, his compound eyes burning with a mixture of disgust and primal fear. This is an abomination, Cadet Maeve, to deliberately psychologically dismantle a galactic delegate, It violates every protocol, every ethical tenet of the fleet. We are peacekeepers, not tormentors. His voice was a low growl, vibrating with suppressed fury. And what is the ethical cost of your inaction, Commander? Zola countered, her gaze steady, unblinking. The imminent collapse of this alliance will lead to regional wars, resource conflicts, and the deaths of millions, perhaps billions. The blood will be on your hands if you cling to outdated protocols while the galaxy burns. Xylos's intransigence is a direct threat to peace. I am merely recalibrating his priorities. She gestured to the datapad she held, which projected a simulation of the Anomaly zone's expansion, now encompassing vital trade routes and even bordering the Tikal's ancestral home system. The data is unequivocal, Commander. Within 3 cycles, the gravitational distortions will begin to destabilize the primary star of the K-Terha system. Irreversible ecological damage will follow, leading to a slow, agonizing repeat of their great blight. My methods, however abhorrent they may seem, are a preventative measure against a far greater conflict, a true Armageddon of physical and ecological devastation. Vorlag's gaze swept from Zola to the horrifying projections, then back to Zola. He saw the inevitable, the cold, hard truth that his own methods had reached their limit. The weight of galactic responsibility settled heavily on his imposing frame. His face, usually a mask of battle-hardened resolve, twisted with profound disgust and desperation. He took a shuddering breath, a sound like grinding stone. "You will proceed," he rasped, the words torn from him. "But understand, Cadet, this is a Rubicon, for you, for humanity, and for the entire Galactic Confederation. The consequences, personal and galactic, will be unlike anything you have ever known." Cathar watched, his internal processors registering the profound moral compromise. Vorlag had crossed a line, betraying his species' deeply ingrained honor code for the sake of pragmatic survival. Zola, however, simply nodded, a steely resolve in her eyes, a hidden thrill of anticipation thrumming beneath her calm exterior. The gamble had paid off. The game was now hers to play. The diplomatic chamber, once a bastion of carefully managed tensions, had become a pressure cooker. The air, typically conditioned to neutrality, was now subtly altered by Zola's design, laden with imperceptible shifts in humidity and trace pheromones that mimic the onset of distress in many species. The lighting system, usually a placid, ambient glow, flickered with barely noticeable undulations, creating a subliminal sense of unease. Delegate Xylos, a sentinel of stoicism, sat at the central table, his arboreal form rigid, his ancient, bark-like skin textured with the wisdom of centuries. Around him, the other delegates, including the exasperated Galaxian and the grim-faced Kr'Varnian representatives, watched with bated breath. Commander Vorlag stood against a far wall, his crimson eyes fixed on Zola, a terrible foreboding in his posture. Cathar, a silent, grim-faced observer, stood beside Zola, his antennae drooping in silent protest. Zola approached Xylos, her footsteps soft on the polished floor, her presence radiating a quiet, unsettling authority. She began not with threats or demands, but with a question, her voice carefully modulated, low and resonant, designed to bypass his intellectual defenses and speak to the deeper, primal parts of his brain. "Delegate Xylos," she began, "your position, as I understand it, is to protect the ancestral territories of the Tikal at all costs. An honorable stance. But what I ask you is the true cost of that honor." She paused, activating a hidden device in her hand. The hollow display above them, instead of showing diplomatic data, now projected a subtle, diffuse green light, mimicking the faint, bioluminescent glow of the Tikal's ancestral forest. But with an almost imperceptible haze, a visual distortion Zola had painstakingly engineered to resonate with the Great Blight's initial signs. A barely audible, synthesized whisper, too low for conscious thought, but designed to resonate with Tikal infrasonic communication, layered itself beneath the hum of the chamber. The sound of drying leaves, of cracking bark. Xylos's bark-like skin, usually impassive, showed the faintest tremor. His pupils dilated minutely. "The cost of honor, Cadet, is the preservation of our people's dignity and future," he stated, his voice a dry rustle, unwavering despite the subtle cues. "A future of what, Xylos?" Zola pressed, her voice gentle, yet sharp as a scalpel. "You speak of protecting ancestral lands, but what if those lands become barren? What if the roots shrivel, the canopy withers, the sacred boughs turn to dust? What if your steadfastness, your unyielding refusal to adapt, leads not to protection, but to a repetition of the very desolation your ancestors fought so desperately to escape. She activated another hidden function. A small, almost invisible pheromone dispenser in her uniform released a carefully synthesized scent, one that T-Cal psychometric data indicated was associated with fungal decay and dying vegetation. It was a smell that spoke of the blight. Xylos's posture stiffened, his ancient, gnarled hands clenching. He tried to maintain his stoic facade, but a low, guttural sound, akin to a whimper, escaped him. "You remember the Great Blight, don't you, Xylos?" Zola's voice dropped, becoming almost hypnotic, a whisper of shared understanding. The slow decay, the terror of isolation in the dark root cities, the gnawing fear that your species would be uprooted, cast adrift from the soil that gives you life. You swore then, didn't you, that such a fate would never befall your people again. She projected images of the anomaly, not as a tactical threat, but as a creeping blight, a slow, inevitable desiccation of the sacred T-Cal star system, the stars of their neighboring allies receding into cosmic indifference. Xylos's resolve began to visibly falter. His leaves, usually a vibrant green, dulled, drooping. The tremor in his hands became a tremor in his entire frame. He looked up at the images, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the projected desolation, the very image of his ancestral nightmare. He was trying to resist. Zola could feel it, feel the immense psychological pressure he was under. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. Zola delivered the final, devastating psychological blow. Her voice rose, filled with a manufactured urgency that mimicked the primal scream of a species facing extinction. "And what if you, Xylos, by clinging to a ghost of honor, become the instrument of that second blight? What if your refusal to compromise, to acknowledge the true nature of this threat, ensures your people's ultimate desolation? Your legacy, Xylos, will not be as a protector, but as the one who, through rigid pride, led the T-Cal back into the darkness. You will be remembered as the one who failed to save them from themselves." The words struck Xylos like a physical blow. His ancient, rigid composure shattered. He let out a keening wail, a sound of profound agony that pierced the stunned silence of the chamber. His body convulsed, his leaves withering rapidly, turning brown and brittle. He clawed at his chest, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended diplomacy, a primal fear of being branded the desolator of his own people. Tears, a viscous sap, streamed down his bark-like cheeks. "No, no, not again the blight, my people. I cannot, I agree. I will agree to your terms. Only save them." "Save my people from the blight?" His voice broke, dissolving into tormented sobs. He had capitulated, but clearly as a broken individual, his spirit irrevocably damaged. The chamber erupted in a stunned, horrified silence. The other delegates stared, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and profound disgust. Vorlag watched, his jaw slack, his powerful frame trembling slightly. The crisis was averted, the alliance saved, but at a cost that none present could have ever conceived. He looked at Zola, no longer with dismissal, but with a terrifying, dawning realization. The Armageddon of the mind, he understood, was infinitely more potent, more destructive than any physical force he had ever commanded. Zola stood over the sobbing Xylos, her face pale, a cold satisfaction in her eyes, quickly suppressed by a wave of profound internal weariness. The victory felt hollow, tinged with a deep, unsettling remorse. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of chilling stillness. Delegate Xylos, his body still racked with tremors, his leaves almost entirely brown, was gently, yet quickly, escorted away by T-Cal aides, his cries of agony fading down the corridor. His emotional state was clearly catatonic, a profound and permanent psychological wound inflicted. The diplomatic chamber, moments before a crucible of raw emotion, was now cloaked in a cold, suffocating silence. The remaining delegates, the Galaxian, the Kr'Varnian, the Xyloran, turned their gaze upon Zola. Their expressions were a complex tapestry of fear, nascent hatred, and a dawning, terrifying understanding. They had witnessed humanity's true strength, and it was nothing they had ever conceived. It was not physical prowess or technological might, but a surgical, devastating penetration of the mind itself. Commander Vorlag approached Zola, his massive form casting a long shadow. His face was unreadable, his compound eyes fixed on her with an intensity that spoke of a profound internal shift. There was no anger, no triumph, only a silent, fearful acknowledgement of the monstrous power she wielded. He didn't speak, but his presence was an unspoken testament to the fundamental paradigm shift that had just occurred. Ensign Cathar, his segmented antennae drooping even further, his face a mask of sorrow and deep moral anguish, looked at Zola. His eyes conveyed a message of profound disillusionment, yet beneath it, Zola sensed a quiet, enduring support for her as a person, even if he condemned her methods. The victory was complete, the alliance was saved, but the air in the citadel felt oppressive, thick with unspoken accusations and a new, chilling respect that was indistinguishable from dread. Zola felt a deep, internal weariness settle over her, a profound isolation amidst her triumph. This was the cost. Weeks later, Zola stood in a stark, austere fleet tribunal chamber, the minimalist design amplifying the gravity of the proceedings. The fleet tribunal panel, composed of elder representatives from a dozen species, sat elevated, their varied forms radiating solemn judgment. Vorlag was present not as a panel member, but as a key witness. Cathar stood beside Zola, his presence a quiet act of loyalty. The lead Xylaran arbiter, its crystalline form shimmering, addressed Zola. Cadet Maeve, you stand accused of egregious ethical violations, including the intentional infliction of psychological trauma upon a galactic delegate, in contravention of Article 3, Section Beta, of the Galactic Peacekeeping Fleet Code of Conduct. How do you plead? Zola's voice was calm, analytical, devoid of apology. I plead necessary. I acknowledge the methods employed, and I take full responsibility for them. However, I argue that my actions, while unorthodox, were a strategic necessity to prevent a far greater conflict, a war that would have resulted in countless deaths and widespread galactic instability. She meticulously presented her defense, using her analytical prowess to dissect the crisis. She detailed the failure of traditional military and diplomatic methods, the escalating tensions, the imminent collapse of the alliance. Commander Vorlag's forces were stalemated. Diplomatic channels had failed. Delegate Xylos, driven by a culturally ingrained trauma, was incapable of rational compromise. My intervention was not an act of malice, but an act of precise, psychological intervention designed to reroute a self-destructive behavioral pattern. It was a preventative measure, akin to a surgeon making a painful incision to remove a cancerous growth. Vorlag was called to testify. His massive form filled the witness stand, his voice a low rumble. While I find Cadet Maeve's methods deeply disturbing and fundamentally opposed to Kr'Varnian principles of honorable combat and direct diplomacy, I cannot deny their efficacy. Her assessment of the Alliance's imminent collapse was accurate. Her prediction of Xylos's unyielding nature was accurate, and her solution averted war. It was, I believe, a necessary evil, however unpalatable. He cast a hard glance at Zola, a grudging admission of her effectiveness warring with his ingrained ethical code. Cathar was next. His voice, usually precise, trembled slightly. I can attest to Cadet Maeve's intellectual integrity and her unwavering commitment to galactic peace. She believes deeply in her methods and in her justification that the greater good outweighs the individual cost. He paused, his antennae twitching. However, I must also voice my profound ethical reservations. The deliberate psychological dismantling of a sentient being sets a dangerous precedent. The power wielded by Cadet Maeve is immense, and its application raises fundamental questions about the future of interspecies relations. We prevented a war, yes, but we also unleashed a new form of warfare, one that operates within the very minds of our adversaries. I fear the ramifications. The tribunal members deliberated for what felt like an eternity, their diverse forms expressing a range of ethical anguish. They were torn between the undeniable results Zola had achieved and the horrifying implications of her methods. Finally, the Xylaran arbiter delivered the verdict. Cadet Zola Maeve, we find you guilty of egregious ethical misconduct, a violation of the sanctity of individual consciousness, and a transgression against established diplomatic norms. Your actions were unconscionable. However, the crystalline arbiter paused, its form shimmering, we also recognize the unprecedented nature of the crisis you averted. Therefore, while we condemn the means, we acknowledge the necessity of the outcome. Zola was not acquitted, nor was she formally disciplined in the traditional sense. The judgment was ambiguous, a stark reflection of the galaxy's struggle to reconcile results with ethics. Humanity's methods were condemned, yet undeniably recognized as effective. The paradigm had shifted. Months later, Zola stood in her new office, a specialized, isolated section of the Citadel, far from the bustling command centers and diplomatic chambers. It was sleek, minimalist, and highly advanced, designed for intricate data analysis and psychological profiling. This was her new domain. Commander Vorlag entered, his uniform impeccably crisp, his movements controlled, but the fear in his compound eyes was palpable, a permanent fixture now. "Cadet Maeve," he began, his voice devoid of the old dismissal, replaced by a wary respect, "your reassignment has been finalized. You are now the director of the Interspecies Psychological Response Unit. Your mandate: to identify and neutralize existential threats to galactic peace through unconventional means." It was a promotion, an undeniable ascent to power, but Zola recognized the subtle containment within it. She was to be humanity's weapon, feared and isolated, but undeniably potent. "My thanks, Commander," Zola replied, her voice calm, a profound weariness deep within her. Vorlag nodded, his gaze sweeping over the sterile, advanced room. "Do not mistake this for approval, Maeve. I still find your methods an anathema, but I have seen what they can achieve. The galaxy is now forced to acknowledge a new truth: that the human mind, once dismissed as primitive, is perhaps the most terrifying force of all. Use it wisely, Cadet. The consequences are yours to bear." He turned to leave, but paused at the threshold. "You have made humanity, and yourself, indispensable. But you are also now a burden to us, a symbol of what we might become. The galaxy will not forget this." As Vorlag's heavy footsteps receded, Ensign Cathar entered, his antennae still carrying a subtle, anxious twitch, but his resolve firm. "Cadet Maeve, I have formally requested reassignment to your unit." Zola turned, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Ensign, I thought your ethical concerns—" "They persist," Cathar interrupted, his voice steady. "Profoundly. But the galaxy has irrevocably changed. Your methods, Cadet, are now a part of galactic diplomacy. It is my duty, as a Catharan and as a sentient being, to understand, to monitor, and to ensure that this new power is wielded with whatever semblance of ethical guidance can be salvaged. If this is the new path, then someone must walk it with you, even if it is to act as your conscience." Zola looked out the viewport at the distant, indifferent stars. She understood. She was a hero, a weapon, and an outcast. Humanity had gained newfound influence, respected now, but with a deep suspicion. The cost of redefining civilization and progress had been paid, and the burden was hers alone to carry. The silent fear she now inspired was a heavy cloak, wrapping around her as she stepped into her new, isolated destiny. She had sought to prove humanity's worth, and she had succeeded, but the innocence she had lost in the process was a price she would bear forever.